welcome y'all to the Institute for Spirituality and Health. Our speaker today is Nathan Carlin, PhD, and we're delighted to have him here to speak on happiness. We're all going to be very happy at the end of this talk, I know. Nate was a magna cum laude graduate and holds honors degrees from Westminster College and Princeton Theological Seminary. He graduated with a PhD from Rice University and is presently Assistant Professor of Medical Humanities. I hope this is up to date. It may not be. At the McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics here in Houston. He also holds an appointment in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at UT School of Medicine, where he teaches a number of courses, including Introduction to Medical Humanities. He's a member of the Houston Galveston Psychoanalytic Society, of which I am a member of, which is altogether wonderful. He's also a member of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, the American Academy of Religion. He serves as editor, sub-editor of the Religious Studies Review, and as book review editor for Pastoral Psychology. He's written about 50 essays, many of them peer-reviewed chapters in books. He's written 2 books I know about. One of them is Beyond Silos, Enhancing Ethics Education in and Across the Health Professions, as well as Living in Limbo. But today, we're going to be happy. This is a happiness talk. Please give a warm welcome to Nathan Carlin.
Well, I'm glad you came out and you're interested in the topic. So thank you for the introduction, John. And so today, just going to talk about a new book project that I'm working on. It's called 100 Years of Happiness, and the subtitle is Insights and Findings from the Experts. Originally I wanted to call it How to Be Happy, and then the subtitle, well, what the experts say. You know, I thought the subtitle would be kind of clever, something like, well, maybe I'm not all that happy, but I know what the experts say, something like that. I thought that would be kind of a clever subtitle. And I think that's kind of retained with the subtitle as it is, Insights and Findings from the Experts. But the press didn't want to go with How to Be Happy. They thought that was too much of a self-help book or something. They wanted something a little more academic, so they changed it to 100 Years of Happiness. I think the self-help title may have sold more books or something, but we'll see. Maybe they were right. I don't know. But we'll talk about that book, and then we'll have some discussion at the end. And so we'll just have 4 parts to the talk. We'll talk about the major books on happiness in and around the 20th century. We'll talk about some methodological issues in studying happiness. Then we'll explore some of the insights and actual findings, and then we'll close with the discussion. So how did we decide what would be in the book, what topics, what authors we would cover? We made up some rules. We said that the book had to have the word happy in the title. It must be published basically around the 20th century. It should be a bestseller or otherwise influential or provide an important intellectual contribution. And when we started, we wanted to pick basically a book a decade. We thought 10 books would be pretty good, but we couldn't find books that were that fit all the other criteria. And we wanted to exclude certain books that were oriented towards a particular religious worldview. There's a book co-authored with the Dalai Lama called The Art of Happiness. That's a pretty important book, but that book is really about Buddhism. So we didn't want to sort of advocate a religious worldview. We really wanted the book to be focused on happiness. And so there was another book like that in the early or late 19th century by Hannah Smith called The Christian Secret of a Happy Life. So that book we excluded for the same reasons. Now there are other books that we could have included, like Alan Watts. Alan Watts is just a major figure in the history of psychology. He writes a book on happiness called The Meaning of Happiness. I felt like I had to give it a shot. But whenever I read the first couple of pages, I thought, well, this is kind of boring. And so then we just kind of exclude books that didn't really appeal to us, because that would be kind of a downer. We thought if you're reading a book on happiness and it's kind of a boring chapter, you know, well, what's that about? So that's kind of how we did it. So we came up with these books. These are the books that made it in. Horace Fletcher's book called Happiness is Found in Forethought Minus Fear Thought. And that kind of awkward title kind of reflects the fact that it's the late 19th century. And but we felt if you read these books, and we ordered them chronologically, you really do kind of get a good sense of what has been said about happiness in the 20th century. And then we also kind of felt that a lot of books that you read really don't need to be books. And that they could be chapters. And so that became the rationale for our project. So you read through our book and you get a good sense of what has been said about happiness basically in and around the 20th century. So what do these authors, what have they said? Well, Horace Fletcher basically argues that happiness isn't something that we have to work too hard at. That just like how nature grows, you know, trees will grow as long as there's sunshine there. Trees will find a way to grow, and or flowers or something like that. And what we really need to do is get the weeds out of the way. And once we do that, happiness will naturally emerge. That's his basic argument. He said, well, what's the greatest weed for, according to Fletcher? The greatest weed relates to future-oriented thinking. Future-oriented thinking often can yield a great deal of hope and pleasure, but other times it can lead to anxiety and worry and fear. So he says what we need to do is hold on to future-oriented thinking, but subtract the fear. And he offers some recommendations about how we can think like that. Hilty thinks that the key to happiness is having faith that there is a moral order to the world. He doesn't say exactly what that moral order is, but once you figure out what it is or live in that, and then have daily practices or work that's rooted or derives from that moral order, that's what will give you fulfillment or happiness in life. Fanon was a journalist. His point is basically about education. He thinks that people are really educated to be unhappy. And that kind of sort of really pans out today, too, when we think about the press. Well, you think, well, think of all the bad news, all the newspapers and radio shows or TV shows that are sold because of bad news. Bad news sells. Good news does not sell. And and also, the dark portraits of life, he says, even among intellectuals. So if you're not just going to bash the media, there's a basic assumption that pessimism or being melancholy is somehow profound, and that happiness is superficial or something like that. And Bertrand Russell basically argues that happiness is attained by having lots of different outward interests, and it can be things like hobbies or work, and lots of affections too, relationships, whether it's friends, family, your lover, and so forth. And having a number of these things that you focus outward, and that leads to happiness. The problem, according to Russell, is that most of us who are unhappy are just simply too self-absorbed. And we're constantly inward looking at our own suffering, and that if we can just turn outward, then we would be happy. Now, all of these arguments are not based on science or in the way that we now think of it. These are not empirical methods. It's just, well, the authors were thinking, well, this is what I think about happiness. I had this experience, or this person says this about happiness, or I talk to people about happiness, and then that's how they get their ideas about happiness, and that's why we use the word insight to refer to that. Now, then there was a great shift towards, from basically the end of the 20th century, or towards the end, towards an empirical turn in psychology where it becomes more scientific. Things have to be rooted in different kinds of evidence, usually in numbers in some way. And so then these people, Myers, Seligman, Layard, are all reflective of a kind of a new turn in happiness. Now, Myers suggests that what we can do, in his book, he basically reviews a lot of the empirical science around happiness, and then just presents it as a consumer's guide. And he tries not to say, well, this is what you can do in order to be happy. You can make your own decisions, but you'd be foolish if you ignored this consumer's guide. Seligman is the founder of positive psychology. He gives us a happiness formula. He says happiness, or one's enduring level of happiness, equals or is somehow dependent on one's set range for happiness. This would be related to one's genetic endowment, one's circumstances, and then those things within one's own voluntary control. And positive psychology tries to focus on the V. What are the things that we can change in our own lives that will make us happier? Layard is an economist. He takes a different point of view. He's not looking at individuals, but he's trying to ask, well, what is it that we can do at a national level or a policy level to make people happy? And he's influenced most greatly by Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, and says that we need to craft policies that ensure the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And we need to set up governments that way in our economies and law and so forth. Nettle, who comes a little bit later, in 2005, publishes his book. He also reviews the empirical literature, but he reads it all through the lens of evolutionary psychology to make sense of some apparent contradictions that we'll talk to a little bit later. But he argues that human beings are simply not programmed to be happy. They are rather programmed to pursue happiness. We'll talk a little bit more about that distinction later. Gilbert is a psychologist at Harvard, and he writes about the happiness literature in light of what we know about the brain. And his books more or less reads like a Psychology 101 class, that he focuses on the problems that the brain has in remembering the past accurately and thinking about the present, and then also in evaluating how we might feel in the future. And Ben Shahar, also affiliated with Harvard, has written maybe the most well-known book in happiness, just called Happier. And it is really a self-help book, and he says so, but it's informed by all of this happiness. And that book became so widely known because he taught the course at Harvard on happiness that became the most popular course at Harvard, and then this book was the key textbook in it. But he argues that becoming happier derives from the fact of increasing activities that give us both meaning and pleasure, both now and in the future. After these thinkers, there were some critics of happiness. Dworkin, a physician, anesthesiologist, also PhD in political science, argues against happiness, saying that this is really almost a narcissistic fascination that America has, and that too many Americans are actually happy, and they're becoming happy in artificial ways. They're using medication to become happier, and they really shouldn't be. happier. He said that people, rather than people are unhappy for good reasons, he says, because they're not living moral lives. And then you take medication, and then you feel happy, and then you don't change anything about your life. So it's kind of a harsh message, but it's an important counter to all the happiness literature. Wilson is in Wake Forest Literature Department, also writes a book called Against Happiness. It's more or less in line with Dworkin, but the argument is that not that too many Americans are unhappy because of medication or something like that, or that they're living immoral lives. Wilson's point is that we're living superficial lives, that a full life includes embracing both happiness and sadness. And one of the most interesting book is by Cecilia Bach, a philosopher. And not many women actually write many books about happiness, which is interesting, that it's usually white men. And maybe that there's some preoccupation that white men have about writing books on happiness. And so it's really important that she wrote this book, and it actually might be the best book on the topic so far. And she argues that she doesn't argue against happiness, but she says that the emphasis on the science to the neglect of the humanities really is misguided and impoverishes the study of the happiness. So we need to return to some of the findings or some of the work of the earlier 20th century, or that kind of thinking in any case. So how is it that we can measure, or there are different ways that we can study happiness. One way is by thinking about ourselves. What is it that makes us happy in our own lives? And this is what William James would have advocated. He would have said all claims about happiness must be measured against introspection, or our own experience. We can study self-narratives, memoirs written by other people. We could read Augustine's Confessions. We could do thought experiments like Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick's philosopher, famous thought experiment, who's trying to argue that happiness is really not a feeling. He says that the problem with thinking that happiness is a feeling is, or if happiness does not have to be rooted in reality, what if we had a happiness machine or an experience machine where we could be plugged into and we would be perfectly happy. We would have the exact lives that we always wanted. All of our desires are fulfilled. But in reality, we're just in a tube, unconscious, floating in water or something like that. Would anybody choose to be in that tub?
No.
You might?
No.
No?
10% of every day.
10% of every day? Yeah. Yeah. Just a little break, yeah. And that's what Nozick kind of hopes for. He thinks the obvious answer to that question is no, that's not happiness, that there's something wrong here. And the movie The Matrix actually plays on that. Mm-hmm. If you remember the kind of Judas character in the movie who chooses to go back into the Matrix so that he can be happy, eat steak, drink wine, and so forth. That's kind of a counterexample. I mean, it's sort of, maybe it goes against Nozick's thought experiment that, well, maybe there are some people that would choose that. And it also sort of then relates to questions of drugs or something like that. If you just follow the thought experiment further, well, what is reality, and to what extent must happiness align with reality? You can study perspective. Montaigne believed in going back and studying the ancients. Well, what is it that Seneca said about happiness, and what is it? How might my perspective influence what I think about Seneca? And so Montaigne's advocating some kind of ongoing circular critical engagement with a particular text or thinker to expand our understanding both of ourselves and of topics. There are the various empirical methods that I mentioned. You can also turn to studying literature or history. What is it that the poets say? Are there some kind of claims to truth that poets might have that simply cannot be tested or measured in any way? Or philosophical investigation, like the thought experiments, or theological inquiry. What is it that our faith traditions say, our religious communities? What are the claims that they make about happiness? Those are all different, not fully compatible ways of studying happiness, but they are all different approaches to the topic. But what is new is positive psychology. Seligman's approach in the flagship book is Authentic Happiness, published 2002. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. He was the former president of the American Psychological Association. And the project of positive psychology is to provide a counterweight or an opposite book known to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. He says, we know a lot about suffering, but what about happiness? Could we create a similar kind of catalog and test it empirically? This would be positive psychology in contrast to regular psychology, or what he just sees regular psychology as negative psychology. But the radical difference here, as I mentioned, is the empirical focus. And you can see a lot of the questionnaires at AuthenticHappiness.com. You can take the tests and so forth, and to have a better feel of, well, what is it? How is it that we exactly measure happiness? What kind of questions do they ask? But Cecilia Bach, again, is pushing on this against the empirical term. She says anybody who claims that they can measure happiness has a lot of questions to answer. What measurements could possibly encompass the depth and scope of conceptions of happiness? By what quantitative standards can one person's happiness be compared to another person's? What numbers make sense in comparing even one person's different experiences from day to day or year to year? And by what indices can personal experience be established by outsiders? So that's a perennial question in the study of happiness. Who's a better judge? The psychologist looking at people, or the subject writing about himself or herself? What numbers can really make sense if I say that I'm on a scale of 1 to 10, I feel 7 today, and I feel, now 10 years from now, if I say I feel 7, are those 7s really the same thing? That's what she's kind of really trying to push against. Now, Gilbert, who outlines the problem with methods better than anybody in his book, Stumbling on Happiness, and he is a psychologist, and he does believe in empirical methods. So he just goes and he lays out all the problems, and you would think that he would come to conclude that it's impossible, but he doesn't think that. But we mentioned some of the different problems in defining happiness. Is it an emotion? Are there different kinds? Are there different degrees? Does happiness have to be rooted in reality? Must it be moral? And if it does have to be moral, well, who gets to define what moral happiness is? And if definitions are required to be measurable, is there something lost that can't be captured with numbers? These are all serious, real, unresolved problems with measurement. Now, there's also problems with subjectivity. One that he outlines is the experience squishing hypothesis, and he talks about the case of Lori and Reba. They are twins, born with their heads attached, and they have completely different personalities. One's real outgoing, one wants to get married, and the other one is an introvert, likes to read. They have basic opposite personalities. But one thing that they can agree on is that they do not want to be separated from one another, from each other, which is pretty common actually with conjoined twins, which is interesting. And then the next claim is that they both report to be very happy. And so whenever for those of us who are not in that condition, it usually invites the response, well, how can that be? If I were in that condition, it would be terrible. I can't imagine my life in that. Well, one explanation for that, some people think, is that experiences are squished together. That, well, what I say by 7 is not what they say by 7, and they really can't know because we're really in two different worlds. Now, on the other side of the coin, there's the experience stretching hypothesis, and he writes about smoking cigars at sunset with his wife when they're on vacation. Now, his wife doesn't smoke cigars, and he does. And whenever they're watching a sunset, he says, well, without the cigar, it's a 7 for me, but if I would have the cigar, it would be 8. And it says his wife just can't understand that. And then he thinks, well, if he would have never had the cigar, he thinks he would have agreed with his wife, but then once you have an experience, you can't take it back. Your range of happiness is expanded. And then it takes more to keep you happy. Those are all sort of interesting theories about subjectivity and how they might relate to happiness. Now, he also talks a lot about how the brain functions looking at the past. Whenever people go through a divorce or some other kind of experience, if they lose their job, they look back at that relationship and they say, or the job, and they say, well, that job just wasn't right for me, or that person just wasn't right for me. They can say that now, but Gilbert's claim is that it's colored by the present experience. That you wouldn't have said that back when you were with the person, but you're constantly rewriting the past in order to tell yourself the best possible story. He makes similar claims about the future. We think, well, when you agree to babysit for your sister or something like that, you say, yes, it'll be great, it'll be fun, because you're looking forward in time. But then when the time actually comes, then you start thinking about the logistics, and you start thinking about car seats, and you think, oh man, I wish I was going to the movies or something like that, not babysitting. And so our brain has problems in imagining what the future is actually going to be like because we're really rooted in the present. He also cites an interesting study about the present, about if we have problems thinking about the past, if we can't remember the past accurately, and if we can't think about the future accurately. He also says we can't know the present accurately, and he cites a study in which there was a bridge, and while some men were walking across the bridge, they would be approached by an attractive woman on the bridge, and then for one group of men, and then the other group, they would wait until they were not on the bridge anymore. And in both cases, the woman said, if you would like to know the results of this study, here's my number, call me, and we'll talk about it. Now, it was a much statistically higher percentage of men who were approached on the bridge who would make the phone call versus the men who would, if they were off the bridge, then they wouldn't make the phone call. Gilbert's interpretation of that is that the men were confusing sexual desire with fear. And that they were being, when they were approached on the bridge, they were really feeling afraid, but because a woman was involved, the brain started thinking about sexual desire, and then they were therefore much more likely to make the phone call. So that's kind of an interesting claim. I think you could come up with counter interpretations to Gilbert's, but that's one of his basic points is about how we constantly make mistakes about the past, the present, and the future. Now he says for all of these problems, he still believes in empirical methods, and he also sticks up for surveys and asking people. He says everything else that we try to correlate happiness with, at the end of the day, has to be connected with what people actually say about happiness. So if we get really into brain scans or something like that, well, how do we know that this part of the brain, when it lights up, is really associated with happiness? Well, we only know that because people are saying that they are experiencing happiness. And the same goes with any other kind of method. Now, this is shifting gears slightly. Now, in positive psychology, there are 6 core values or virtues. Wisdom and knowledge, courage, love, humanity, justice, temperance, spirituality, and transcendence. And they said, led by their colleague, Catherine Dalsgaard, said, we read Aristotle and Plato, Aquinas and Augustus, the Old Testament and the Talmud, Confucius, Buddha, Lao Tse, the Quran, Benjamin Franklin, and so forth. And so that they say they get these 6 virtues or values from reading all of these world's religious traditions. What do you think about this? What would your how would you critically engage this quotation? So this is at the core of positive psychology. These 6 claims about virtues or values, and that they're rooted from this study that they did of the world's religious tradition. Are there any problems with this, do you think? Or what questions might we ask?
They only used religious traditions to determine how.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, you could say, well, maybe it's too heavily skewed towards religion. You know, there you got some Plato and Aristotle. Maybe it's too, well, why turn to the world's religious tradition? That's a good point, yeah. Maybe it's too religious, not secular enough or something.
Well, I mean, some people who wouldn't be religious would consider some sources there.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't guess you're bringing up whether or not this is innate in humans. Whether these are, since they're found in all this 3,000-year history or whatever, is it not just something that is evolved, that's innate?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the claims that they're trying to make, that there's something universal. He doesn't want to use the word universal, he wants to use the word ubiquitous, but he's trying to say that this is innate, or that these values are somehow true because they've been around for 3,000 years. Well, when I looked at this, I thought, well, who is Catherine Dalsgaard? Well, then I looked up about her, and, well, she's a psychologist. And I thought, well, why would we trust somebody trained in the social sciences to read Plato and Aristotle? And then I thought, well, who could possibly claim to be an expert on all of these traditions? Something like, it's just an outrageous claim. I mean, in a sense, it's outrageous to say that you're an expert about any one of these topics. To be an expert in Aristotle? I said, well, geez, man. Maybe you could say that after the end of 40 years of study or something, at the end of a career or something like that. Whenever you do a PhD in the Bible, I mean, you don't claim to be an expert about a book of the Bible. You'd write a passage about 2 verses in Isaiah, and you think, well, okay, now maybe I know something, But they're saying they read everything for 3,000 years, and then claiming that it's somehow valid. My point was that, well, it seems more likely that you have 6 values or virtues. You just make them up, and then you say, well, all these religious traditions say we're right. I think the process was the reverse of kind of what they're suggesting. And if they're serious about the process, I think it's just deeply superficial and doesn't understand what history is or the study of literature. It's completely misguided. To me, I think it's a very, very embarrassing quotation, and it's at the core of positive psychology. And they don't even seem to know it, which is kind of odd. And so now that was a long kind of way of talking about what kind of writings have been on happiness. Now, this is kind of what a lot of people are really interested in. And so, what is it that people have found? Acknowledging all of the problems of empirical methods and so forth. Okay, so we've worked through that. Well, now actually, what do people say? There's a lot of agreement on the empirical findings. On marriage and relationships, people who are married do tend to be happier, or they report to be happier than people who are cohabitating, single, separated, or divorced. What's unclear is whether the directionality of causality in this association is unclear. It's unclear if happy people are more likely to get married, or if married people are more likely to be happy. We don't know about that. What's interesting also is that widowed persons display the greatest variability of happiness. It ranges very high and very low. But marriage does seem to be good for happiness, or happiness seems to be good for marriage. Children, it's widely believed that children are associated with happiness. That does not bear to be the truth. There's many studies indicating that when a couple gets married, the first few years of marriage, the happiness levels dramatically drop once you have children. They become the lowest when your kids are teenagers. And when do they rise again? They rise when your kids go to college. And you say that's true, huh? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we always said that teenage was what made you allow your children to leave home.
That's right. Yeah.
That prepared you for wanting them to go.
Yeah, and that's sort of the method of sort of introspection. So you see the empirical finding, you say, well, yeah, that's how it was for me, and well, it seems valid. Now, that's a very offensive thing to kind of say, well, children just don't make us happy. There might be a problem with the word happiness here. There might be a distinction to be made between actually feeling happy, something like, well, I had a glass of wine, I feel pretty good, or something like that, versus judgments about happiness or life satisfaction. I think it is pretty likely that having kids in the long run makes you feel more satisfied with your life, but you won't necessarily experience that while you're raising them, or something like that. I think that could be what's behind the contradiction between what we want to say. There's another explanation for it we'll get to in a minute. Now, there's also many, many, many studies that indicate that money or income does not yield to great gains in happiness. Once basic necessities are covered, the more money you make, you will not become any happier. And we've seen this finding replicated decade after decade. But what does seem to be associated to a greater extent with happiness is not income level per se, but social class. That in a very real sense, janitors today make about what doctors would make 60 years ago today in actual dollars, but janitors are not any happier today. Janitors don't report the level of happiness that doctors did 60 years ago. Why? Because being a janitor is not very well respected by society. Being a physician is very well respected by society. And those things do seem to be associated with happiness. Also, time is associated with happiness as well. To have control over your own time and your own tasks makes a great deal of difference with your own personal happiness versus income. Some other findings that have been replicated time and time again is that neither sex is happier than the other. It's also claimed or found in these studies that women tend to be both happier and sadder than men. The findings might be what the findings are, or this could be a subtle version of sexism of saying, well, women are more emotional than men. I don't know if it's sexism or if it's true, but this is what the studies are saying. Age also There's no age cohort that's happier than any other, but similar to findings on sex and gender, as people age, they tend to experience less extreme emotions. You can see that in a dramatic way with teenagers. You know, something bad goes wrong, and you think, well, the world's going to end. This is terrible. I'm going to end it all. And then the next day, they're fine. And so that tends to go away as people age. And the activities that older persons find meaningful are different, or not meaningful, but are important to their happiness, are different than younger persons. It's more important for older persons to have good social events, good social relationships, versus young people. Work is more important for young people, and if they're happy at work, they report higher life satisfaction. Race is not associated with happiness in any way. Religion does seem to be associated with happiness, and much of the literature overlaps with a lot of what John likes to talk about, what Ken likes to talk about. It's not that any particular religion is happier than any other, but it appears that social connections provided by religion and frameworks of meaning provided by religion tend to make people happier, or help them report to be happier. Some countries are happier than others, and at the first glance, a greater income level does help a country to be happier than others. But then once you start looking at the data more closely, it has more to do with a stable democracy than actual income. That's why the Scandinavian countries tend, even though they're not nearly as wealthy as the United States, tend to report to be happier than the United States. And then if you find countries where there's income levels are decent, but there's war or something like that, then they will report to be very unhappy. Climate, surprisingly, does not seem to make a difference in terms of happiness. You think, well, if we just moved to San Diego, we'd all be better off or something. But we get used to San Diego, and climate doesn't tend to make a difference. Neither does living in a town or a city. That doesn't seem to affect happiness. The only exception to this is if you suffer from something like seasonal affective disorder, and that seems to be obvious. Now, what is it that makes a difference in happiness? The greatest variable is personality type. And if people tend to be more neurotic, they tend to be less happy. And neuroticism can be measured in different ways. And in extroversion, the more extroverted a person is, the more likely it is that they'll report to be happy. For extroverts, there's lots of interesting things. Well, why is this? Well, extroverts do pleasurable activities more than introverts do. They're more likely to have been to a party or to have had sex or something like that than introverts whenever you ask them. And but that seems to be, and that's kind of where positive psychology focuses on, is that if we can address some of these personality characteristics, if we can change them in some way, if we can change thinking or behavior in some way, that will lead to higher enduring levels of happiness. So that's where they focus their attention. And that seems to be right to me. So how is this knowledge produced? We talked about a couple of studies already. But some of the studies, just to give you a flavor of how the knowledge is generated, there are weather studies. You'd be sitting at home, you'll get a phone call, and somebody will ask you to take a survey, and they found that if you didn't mention anything about the weather, people who are in a sunny climate or having good weather that day, they're going to report a much greater overall life satisfaction if it's a sunny day versus a rainy day, unless you mention the weather. If you point out to the person, hey, it's nice weather that you're having down there in Houston, and once you bring weather to somebody's attention, that will change how they answer your questions. So that was a pretty interesting study. So and that's just give you an example of how these knowledge is generated. Now, there's also activity studies. This is a nice one because it was about Texas, 900 working women in Texas. They said, well, what did you do yesterday? And in general, people would come up to 12 or 14 different activities. They would rate their happiness levels according to their activity, and they would also rate how much time they spent doing that activity. And sex came out to be number one. That was the highest on the scale. Socializing made Texas women happy. Exercising, taking care of children, it's going down. Working, people were not too happy with working. And the lowest on the list was commuting. And that seems to make it, that's a pretty interesting finding. If you go back to David Myers and saying, well, this is the consumer's guide to happiness, and if you can make decisions, well, if you know everybody hates commuting, and this is consistently found again and again, if you can have a bigger house in Sugar Land versus an apartment in River Oaks or something like that, well, maybe you should go for River Oaks, if you're thinking about your happiness. But you think, well, I thought the big house was going to make me happy, but you get used to the big house, and you're not going to get used to commuting. So these are kind of the recommendations that people are going to make. And they also do different kinds of happiness studies where there'll be a beeper, if you have a beeper, that'll go off at random times during the day, and then you have to log your happiness. And happiness tends to be, in this study with 900 women, happiness was pretty low at 8 a.m. It was the highest during the workday at lunchtime, during break. Then it drops, and then it rises, keeps rising for the rest of the day. So that's how we know. And it is pretty obvious, too.
People are having sex at lunch.
Yeah, that's it. People are having sex on their lunch break. I think that's how we can make sense of all of the data. Yeah. And another interesting one study that I really liked, it was a study about wallets. They do different kinds, the World Value Survey, there's different kinds of studies that you can put together. They say, generally speaking, would you say that people can be trusted, or would you say that you can't be too careful when you're dealing with people? How much do you trust people? And the World Value Survey found that only 5% of people in Brazil would say that you can trust people. But contrast that with 64% in Norway. Now, Norway always scores near the happiness, or near the top on these country happiness surveys. And so that's interesting that people also say that Norwegians think that Norway is safer, or you can trust people more than other countries. So there seems to be a relationship between happiness and trust. But what about actual safety? Is Norway safer, or can you really trust people? Well, they would drop wallets in different countries, and that they found, and they would leave the address inside. And they found in the countries that say people can be trusted, there was a much greater likelihood that the wallet would actually be returned. So that does seem to provide a kind of validity to what people are saying. And whenever studies get to become this kind of complex, have these kind of multi-level dimensions, then I'm pretty impressed, and I believe them. Then we have different kinds of brain studies. That seems to be a hot topic now, and it also relates to psychotropic drugs. There's one interesting study with monkeys, and Prozac was in serotonin levels, that monkeys that appear to have lower social status in a troop will have lower serotonin levels than higher monkeys, or the alpha male in the group. But if you give a monkey that's low on the social status level Prozac, it will rise to become the alpha male in the troop, which also tends to provide a kind of validity to something actually going on in the brain, that happiness really is rooted in chemistry in some fundamental way, or you at least cannot ignore the brain and happiness. And then there's also different kinds of meditation studies that monks seem to be happy people. Why is that? Well, the happiest man alive, it's been said, is Ricard, and it's one of our personal friend and colleague of ours, Alejandro Chaul. He always assigns readings from his happiness book, And it was found with brain scans with Ricard that his left frontal lobe is, whenever he meditates and goes into a deep spot of peace, it's just dramatic, way higher brain activity than anybody else, more than other monks, more than any other regular people, and that part of the brain is associated with levels of happiness. So meditation does seem to be good for your health, or at least good for happiness. And you say, well, why? How could that possibly be? Well, we have other studies in the history of psychology and neurology. There's the case of Phineas Gage, where he was a railroad worker in 1848. There was an explosion, and a metal rod went through his face and then out through the top of his skull, just like in the picture there. And he was fine. Because the metal rod only destroyed his frontal lobe. And that's how we started to learn what the frontal lobe does. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that evolved the latest during evolution or evolutionary history. And it's also related to future thinking. And so with other people, but it did dramatically change his personality. And we've had other patients in the history of psychology. Most recently in '81, the patient NN, who was in a car accident, and it destroyed major parts of his frontal lobe. And we have lots of interviews with him where he's simply unable to talk about tomorrow. If you ask him what he can do, what he's going to do tomorrow, he says he can't tell you. And you say, well, what are you thinking about when I ask you about tomorrow? And he says, it's like a blank slate. He can understand the concept of tomorrow, but he just simply cannot imagine himself in it. And so also during the mid-20th century, psychiatrists and surgeons got together to perform lobotomies on patients suffering from anxiety and depression, and it worked. Why? Because they were destroying the frontal lobe, and they got the man responsible for this, Moniz, even won a Nobel Prize in medicine for it. Well, why did it work? Well, it's because the frontal lobe is related to future thinking, and what is anxiety related to? Future thinking. That's what we worry about. We're anxious about the future. And it's also interesting that this kind of takes us back to Fletcher in 1898 when he's saying happiness is forethought minus fear thought. Well, if the left frontal lobe is associated with future thinking and happiness, it's the right frontal lobe that is associated with anxiety. So Horace Fletcher in 1898 anticipated really what the brain studies did bear out over the course of the 20th century and the 21st century. So how can we make sense of all the findings? Well, the major hermeneutic, until maybe people like Cecilia Bach and others, there's a book by Sarah Ahmed that I haven't read yet, but I suspect that it's going to be very critical of evolution as a hermeneutic. Feminists tend to be critical of evolutionary psychology, but evolutionary psychological interpretations are holding the day right now in positive psychology or studies of happiness. And you say, well, why is it that people say they're basically happy? You say, well, I'm a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. But no, not many people are going to say 9 out of 10, you know. And then nobody's really going to say 10 out of 10. Well, the evolutionary explanation for this is, well, unhappiness is not attractive to mates, but being perfectly happy, if we all say, well, I'm a 10, well, then you wouldn't do anything. You have no more striving. It would lead to complacency. So the evolutionary psychology suggests that saying a 7 or an 8 is exactly what we would expect people to do, and they do it. You say, well, why don't things like winning the lottery or receiving an award or sex lead to lasting happiness? They might lead to temporary spikes in happiness, but why don't they make us perfectly happy? It's the adaptation effect. People tend to get used to things that they had, and there's a good evolutionary reason for this, because whenever you hear a really good piece of news, you can't think about anything else. You might be like this for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and there's really nothing that you can do. You can't simply go back to work. So we have to come back to reality at some point. We have to get used to pleasure and spikes in happiness. And so that's what how we have evolved. Now, why is marriage associated with happiness? Well, it's in the interest of the species to mate, survival, and it's also in the interest of society to encourage stable family units. Well, okay, then the final confusing question about happiness: why do we tend to focus our energies on activities that will not lead to happiness, things like raises, and neglect things that often do lead to happiness, such as freeing up our time? Why do we constantly work against ourselves? And this takes us back to Nettle, that we are programmed to pursue happiness, not to experience it. So we always need that carrot out in front of us to keep us moving, because that's what is going to drive us as people and as a species to bigger and better. So it's a pretty clever interpretation of the empirical data that's out there. Now, whenever I talk to people, they always say, well, what do you think? You've read all this stuff, and even though our book is really not meant to advocate a particular point of view, in our final chapter, we have a fictional conversation with my co-authors sitting down. We imagine all of these authors presenting at a conference, and then we go and we sit in a coffee shop and we just talk about the presentations. And then we also offer a list of 7 things. I offer a list of 7, and Don Capps, my co-author, offers a list of 7 things. So I provide you here with my 7 keys to happiness. And it is, number 1 for me is organize your time, take time to reflect on your priorities, and act accordingly. Spend time with friends and family. Cultivate creativity into your life through things like writing, playing music, and building things. Create a complex self-identity. That means that you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket. You shouldn't be only about your work. You should have hobbies or friendships, other things that are important to you. So whenever one thing goes poorly or badly, your whole identity is not at stake. Don't value money or material possessions. You will get used to them. We know that. Whether it's a new iPhone or a new iPad or a big house or a new car, you will get used to it. Don't value those things. But things that you will not get used to are experiences. And I think this takes me back to Tal Ben-Shahar, who wrote the Happiness book. He said, if you value experiences and you constantly increase the number of pleasurable things and you spread them out over time, whether things rooted in pleasure, maybe it's food or sex or things like that, and then activities that give us meaning, such as writing or canoeing or spending time with your children or making phone calls to friends or things like that. Those types of activities tend to give us meaning. Some activities give us pleasure, other activities give us meaning, and if we can spread them out in little bits, this will lead us to become happier. And so that's kind of my list. It's not meant to be a list for anybody else. You can create your own list. And one example about viewing experiences rather than material things, I went to Brazos Bend Park with my partner, and we stumbled across these 2 turtles and a baby alligator on that log. And that just made us extremely happy. And I don't know exactly why. I think it's because it was a baby, they're all very small. It was nice to see animals from 2 species together, and they were just on the log hanging out. They weren't enemies or anything like that. And it also, it seemed like, well, this is it was kind of like a rare experience. It was kind of, we felt lucky. It's sort of like, well, you can't get this if you come there anytime. It's just, well, this is it. You get it one time. And we were here, it's kind of, but that was kind of the experience. And so then, we try to make it a goal to kind of do one thing a month that's kind of out of the ordinary to provide some kind of experience of pleasure or meaning. If you went to Brazos Bend Park, just 15 miles out of the city, if you went there every day, well, then you would get used to it, the adaptation effect. But if you go there once a year or something like that, then it can be a pretty pleasurable and meaningful. Now, the last part here is just some discussion. We can talk about these questions. You know what? I don't think I don't. Here are the questions, but maybe it's better just to talk. I had, is happiness a feeling? Does happiness have to be grounded in reality? Must happiness be moral? Are religion and happiness at odds in some way? And what religious or spiritual insights inform your views on happiness was the final question. Maybe we can talk about that one. I'd just like to open it up. We don't have too much time. Don't want to keep you here all night. But what do you think about happiness?
I wanted to make an observation. You said we're geared or we're designed to pursue happiness.
Yeah, that's right.
It's really interesting because of the definition of spirituality that Ken Pargament uses is the quest for the sacred. So again, it's pursuing something.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're never satisfied. So we're always questing. We're always pursuing. By nature, at least.
That's right. Yeah.
I thought that's an interesting insight, and if we could settle back and celebrate the moment, which may be two turtles on a log, you know, that really is. And someone handed me a book. It was Lex gave me a book, and it was in well, I don't remember even the author. It said his brother or somebody, but. What he was saying in there was, the book is on gratitude. And what he was saying in there, at least at the very beginning of the book, which we just started, is that surprise is very important to gratitude. And then he talked about how exciting it is, how excited we are when we look up and we see a rainbow in the sky. And we're surprised every single time. It's like, did you see that rainbow? We called to everybody. So, and we do get happy.
Yeah.
So I think surprise must be part of what you're talking about. Everything else in life we get so conditioned to that we no longer appreciate or value them or even have gratitude for them.
That's right.
So I think you're right on that. That if we can experience the surprises of life and we can't make them happen. They just, we have to celebrate them when they do occur. Yeah. When they do happen.
That's right. Yeah.
And not miss them.
Yeah.
Like the two turtles on the log.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's another key point that many poets often make too about happiness, that if you're really trying to pursue it, well, you're not going to find it. You know, but if you shoot your arrow at another target or something like that, well, then you just might. You know, you'll find it as a surprise. And I like the point about God. You know, the quest for God. You know, that's Augustine and Calvin deeply influenced my own religiosity or spirituality, and both of them would say, well, we really cannot ultimately be happy in this life. You know, it's the next life. You know, it's that Augustine says we have a God-shaped hole in all of us. We try to fill it with other things, but those things, that hole can only be filled with one thing, and that's God. But we try to fill it with other things, you know. And so that would be a theological claim about happiness or fulfillment, you know, from my own tradition. Other thoughts or questions or?
I never thought about doing studies or anything about happiness until I got to Houston.
Oh,
and all of a sudden I started finding all of these grad students who are majoring in happiness or something.
Oh, were they? Yeah.
Writing papers and you know, such on happiness. So what prompted this? Yeah. It's certainly a more recent pursuit, is it not?
It is. It really is.
Happiness. Did y'all run out of topics? Or
Well, psychologists. Well, they really did. We did the negative stuff, but we got a whole new field here, right? Yeah. You could take a cynical view of positive psychology and all of that. You could one reading of it could be purely economic. There have been, you just look at the book industry, and there are self-help books published, hundreds, maybe thousands of these books published every year, and then psychologists, somehow figure this out, and you say, well, why shouldn't we need to make some of that money too? And and we can do it better, something like that. Because what's interesting is you have David Meyer's book in 1992, which is a pretty early book on happiness that's doing the empirical studies. So you have psychologists doing studies and writing journal articles, because that's what psychologists tend to do. They tend to write articles, not books. So you just have this massive, number of articles being produced. Then you have somebody like Myers saying, well, I'll put it all together. It's a good effort. But then 10 years after that, you see Martin Seligman, 2002, you say, well, Myers' book, well, that was a bestseller. And then everybody starts seeing that. And then Ben Tal-Shahar just comes out and says it. That's what I'm doing, He just says that, but I'm going to outdo all of you by putting this in a readable language, in a fun language, in his happier book. Like if you really wanted one book to be practical and informed, I would do Tal Ben-Shahar's book. If you just had to read one, and that's the Harvard book. I wouldn't read my book. I wouldn't. I would read Tal Ben-Shahar's book. That's if you really wanted to. Be a happier person or something like that. That's just a tremendous book. But if you wanted the most interesting book, I thought of all the reading that I did was the Nettle book, and that goes to the evolution point, because you can, in some sense, all of the books are kind of the same. You just go through the empirical literature, and all the findings tend to be all the same. But Nettle's point is just so, his book is just so well argued and interpreted, because he synthesizes the data and interprets it in a compelling way. And I think everybody else just assumes an evolutionary perspective, basically in psychology. But he writes about it beautifully, I think.
We talk about suffering, that it's important to have meaning, to find meaning. There's nothing worse than to suffer but have no meaning. So if you have any, is there any connection with happiness and meaning? I wonder, because it doesn't seem like there would be.
Yeah, that is going to be no, that is the argument. It connects with the religion and health literature. Is that happiness? Why is it that people that have a lot of meaning in their lives are happy? Well, it's because it becomes kind of circular. It's sort of, well, that's what happiness is. It's sort of happiness. Well, happiness is meaning. Happiness is pleasure. It is meaning, and so it just becomes defined in that way. For Tal Ben-Shahar, that's what he says. That happiness is two things: it's meaning and it's pleasure. Okay. It's those two things, and you have to have both. You could have pleasure without any meaning, but that's not going to be happy. Real happiness in his point of view. Pleasure without meaning. Just drinking all the time or something like that, or seeing a prostitute or something. Something like that. Pleasure without meaning, but you can also have meaning without pleasure, and that could be people. I think he uses the example of like martyrs, something who have a great deal of meaning, but they might not have much pleasure. And I think that becomes a difficult issue to wrestle with. Then you think, well, martyrs are, how happy was Christ on the cross or something like that. There's lots of meaning there, but not much pleasure. But it's, something like it becomes hard to sort out. That's why conceptions of happiness are so difficult, because anytime you pick on one definition or one aspect, there seems to be problems with it. But I think it was, who was it? There was somebody who compared happiness to time, because St. Augustine said, I know what time is, but I just can't explain it to you. Or when I try to explain it to you, I no longer know what time is. And so there's similar claims made about happiness. Like everybody seems to know what happiness is, just like we seem to know what time is. But then whenever we try to articulate it in any meaningful way, it falls apart. Yeah.
In our culture, so many people seem to think they'll be happy when they retire later in life. And, they get there and then they often drop dead. But I like your 7 things that you listed because they don't require, quitting work. They don't require any changes in anything except being aware, really, of how you measure your time, how you will use it, your friends. The things you listed were really very effective, so thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I'm a psychologist in independent practice, and for years I've had patients come in and say, I just want to be happy.
Yeah.
And my standard response to them has always been, I don't do happy, I do content.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
And I'd be curious to know how contentment fits with what we're talking about in terms of happiness.
Yeah,
and that doesn't mean be content
Yeah.
with a bad situation or be content
No.
to be depressed.
That's right.
Not my opinion.
Yeah, that fits in with what Bach is saying, and other people, and psychologists do address it, and they try to use different words for happiness. So if you want to talk about joy tends to be a particular moment of happiness. It's sort of momentary, like, well, I won the lottery. Well, that's joy, something like that. Or euphoria. That's right. Joy tends to be associated with euphoria. Or college graduation, like on graduation day. Yeah, this is joyful. But then over time, you can still be happy about graduation, but it's not without the euphoria. You can be proud of your own accomplishments. That psychologists tend to refer to that in terms of life satisfaction, or they might use words like content or something like that.
That's a good word, satisfaction.
Yeah.
I don't think this has never been a pursuit of mine.
No.
Happiness is not something I aim for. It's not something I raised my children to look for. There were other values in life that had more meaning to me than happiness. But satisfaction is a good word.
Yeah.
If that equates with happiness.
Yeah, that's right.
You
like
satisfaction? In whatever state you find yourself, you may not really be happy in that state. But there should be a certain amount of acceptance or contentment or satisfaction.
Yeah. And I like, on the satisfaction and contentment point, well, one person we haven't talked about today who I like Freud a great deal, and he's generally regarded as a happiness pessimist. Freud, Sigmund Freud. He's regarded as a happiness pessimist, and he says, well, we really can't be happy in life. He says that the best we can hope for is ordinary unhappiness. You can be miserable, or you can be just basically unhappy like the rest of us, or something like that. That's kind of what Freud was saying. That's the best we can hope for. And it seems to be related to the degree question. If there's misery, you're basically unhappy, or maybe we can be content, or maybe we can be really happy, or something like that.
I think there's something culturally too today about wanting to be happy, because my daughters tell me all the time, they say, all of their friends say, I just want my children to be happy.
To be happy.
And she said, that thought never crossed my mom's mind. That was what she was worried about. She had other things she wanted to teach us. I said, that's really true. I didn't aim to make you happy little children. No. I wanted you to mature and grow in character and values and things like that, but didn't equate in my mind to happiness. So if you have those things, then I guess you might term that.
You might
happy.
then turn out to be happy. Yeah. Yeah, but you don't pursue happiness in and of itself. I like that point. I think that would be in line with a lot of the critics of happiness too, like with Dworkin or Wilson. What they're saying is, well, you know what? You really shouldn't be kind of building your life around trying to be happy. You know?
Sounds shallow.
Yeah, it sounds shallow. Maybe if you focus on, doing something good for society, or good relationships, then happiness or contentment. Go back to the point about, contentment. And say, well, how is it that we can be content in life? And it's by...
You didn't mention altruism, but what you just said, isn't that where most people, I hear many of them say, when I went to Open Door Mission, when I served food in a bread line, soup line, that I was so blessed by that experience.
That's right.
Wouldn't that be
absolutely
another factor?
I know, and the ethicist Peter Singer really likes to point that out. And then he says that it apparently is also borne out with the brain scans that when we live altruistically, it sort of lights up similar parts of the brain as if you have really good food or something like that. That altruism,
serving others, or reaching out beyond yourself,
makes us happy.
From our selfish nature to being a giving person.
I think that's been Oprah's message to the world.
Yeah, it's a good one. That's a good message. Yeah.
Interestingly, we had medical students come here in batches of 50 from Baylor College of Medicine, and the question they asked this year for me to answer was, will I be happy in medicine?
Oh.
And
that was
really a profound question, because they're going to go into great debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars, many of them,
I want to know if it's worth
and spend all of this time in the having no time to their own self. And will I be happy was they wanted to know. And I was able to tell them I was a physician for 15 years, and I will say that every single day I was a physician, I was happy. And you could see the relief come across the room. I mean, it was really a concern that these young men and women had. Because they're investing so much, and it's really costly. It's not an easy thing for them to do.
And I try to encourage medical students as, during their third year, I have a decent amount of interaction with them. I said, well, think about happiness whenever you're trying to choose which specialty. And, I try to pass along some of these findings. And I don't offer advice myself, but they sort things out themselves. And it's fun, and it's nice whenever they... it's pretty anxiety-provoking when you don't know what you want to be,
Well, this is great. Thank you so much.
This is good. Yeah.